Thank you for listening to the Water Christian Podcast. I'm Mark Stanley, your host, and today we're going to take a break from the dismal conversations that have plagued this podcast. You know, I promise I didn't intend for this to become the Get Depressed podcast. I feel like we've talked so much about the darker themes in Dostoevsky, and then the critique of Jordan Peterson, who I love, despite my reservations and critiques, obviously. And then the episode about the Holocaust, and then now Viktor Frankl and his work, which is tragically optimistic. I mean, it's very tragic. He has a very optimistic tone. You know, it's very hopeful. It's very meaningful. But I don't think you can deny that it's also very heavy. Not exactly light reading material. And then, of course, our next series is going to be on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian pastor and theologian who was a German during Hitler's rise to power. And he was actually part of a coup attempt, which almost assassinated Hitler several times. I did not realize that there were, I think, 8 attempts on Hitler's life. I had no idea. Some of them were extremely close to being successful. So when you read his biography, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's, it sounds like a spy novel. Just with how close he was several times, and he was working for the German intelligence agency, and very, very interesting stuff. And of course, because he's a Christian and a theologian, he's got all kinds of really great ideas about how Christians should stand up to tyranny and what Christians should do in the face of tyranny and horror. He was killed by the Nazis just before the war ended, leaving behind a fiancée. So that's going to be, depressing stuff too. And I just realized after my series on Ordinary Men, Browning's Ordinary Men, boiled down to a single episode, I couldn't actually stretch that into a series. And at that point I decided, all right, it's time to do something completely different before coming back to our current theme. So a few weeks ago, I was on a backpacking trip, and I had a conversation which was really riveting about the philosophy of art. And I forgot how passionate I am about beauty and art and their relationship and kind of the philosophy of beauty and art. And I think some informed discussion will be really valuable to you. So it's time that we take the next step in our series that's kind of running throughout the podcast. Episode 11, if you'll recall, was titled Artists, Philosophers, and the Power of Narrative. And it was on how art interacts with philosophy and how philosophy interacts with everyday life. But today, we're going to ask the question, how should we think about art and beauty? Is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Is beauty actually just a sophisticated form of pleasure? Or is it something higher? Because if the sublime is real, then beauty is out there in the world, and you're actually missing out if you don't go out there and find it. And that would also mean that we might need properly tuned taste in order to detect or appreciate art. Meaning, if beauty is real, you might miss it if you're too busy looking at a screen or preoccupied with your daily life. Or perhaps it is all subjective and empty. Then we don't have to ask hard questions about good or bad taste. It's all just preference. Art is like broccoli. Either you like it or you don't. But as we'll see, on that view, it doesn't really make sense to talk about art at all. What's all the fuss about? Why obsess over it? Regarding each individual piece of art, it either gives you pleasure or it doesn't. Movies are like onions, just a matter of preference. But if art itself is predicated on the idea of sharing ideas and experiences with one another, then there must be something to talk about. There must be objective features which make some art better than other art. And I think deep down, we recognize that if you might enjoy The Simpsons more than you enjoy Shakespeare, but if you were stranded on an island for the rest of your life and you could have every episode of The Simpsons or every work of Shakespeare, you should probably pick the latter. I think we have an intuition that if we were properly formed, if we were the best possible version of ourselves, that we would have a developed taste for things we know to be truly good, but in reality we haven't been exposed or to the great material, or we aren't motivated to try something new, and we have no reason to think that it's actually better than what we do enjoy. Even though we know intellectually that Shakespeare is really good, we just don't connect with it, we don't enjoy it, and so we don't engage with it. And the reason I think you'll care about the conversation that we're going to have in this episode is because you'll discover that if you inherit the beliefs of the culture about art, that it's all just subjective, that everything is essentially the same, that there are no standards with which to judge, then it turns out that you'll miss a lot of truly beautiful things in the midst of the chaos. Having a clear mind about art allows you to develop your own taste for music, for literature, for movies, for architecture, for everything. Seeing beauty as a feature of the world can inspire you to seek out new and higher forms of beauty. You can always be on the precipice of your next great discovery. You can also become the kind of person who sees beauty all around you rather than the kind of person who doesn't see beauty at all, and instead just sees beauty as mere pleasure. There's no such thing as beauty on a modernist or postmodernist subjectivist view. But I think seeing beauty is an important capacity you possess, which is foundational for living a happy life. But before we get into it, please go to our social media outlets on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Like, follow, and subscribe to support our project. Leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoy the podcast or believe in our mission, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support our work on our website, wellreadchristian.com. There, you will also find interesting quotes, sources, articles, and more available free of charge. These are tough times for all of us, and if your contribution would cause any amount of financial pressure, please do not even consider it. But for those who are willing and able to give, it is because of your gift that the podcast can continue and even grow. So thank you. If you've never thought critically about art or beauty before, you probably have inherited the cultural view that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It makes sense at the surface level. Every person is different. Every person has different tastes and preferences. And so you can't really judge whether one song is better than another. I like rock. You like rap. What else is there to say? She likes War and Peace. She likes Twilight. What's the difference? But upon further inspection, it turns out that maybe it's not that simple. It does seem objectively wrong to say that the latest pop song is better than Mozart just because it has more downloads on Spotify. It can't be that Sharknado is an equally good movie to Citizen Kane just because Sharknado might actually keep my attention for longer. Furthermore, when we discuss art or artists, we seem to have reasons for why we like certain things, which are not subjective. We don't just say, I like it, or I don't like it, which is the end of the conversation if we're talking about broccoli. But if we're talking about paintings, we can identify all sorts of objective features which make us like it or dislike it. The color used, the impressions given, the lines, the symmetry, the depth, the parallelism, the symbolism. There are all kinds of ingredients to a great work of art. Another example is fine cuisine. Obviously, there is subjectivity in the preparation of food, the combinations of flavors and ingredients, but I don't think anybody is going to argue that Jack in the Box is better than something a true chef might make in a 5-star restaurant. So there does seem to be objective standards which act as boundaries for reasonable opinions and tastes. And when we do find art that we like, we're able to give specific reasons why we like it. You prefer your steak rare, I prefer it medium. But you have bad taste if you prefer it raw or burnt to a crisp. Just nobody likes it that way. That's not how the meal is supposed to be prepared. So how do we untangle this mess? There seems to be two indisputable facts which are at odds, which produce quite the paradox. On one end, art appreciation seems to be subjective, since there are so many different and mutually exclusive opinions on art and beauty. But on the other hand, if it's all subjective and therefore completely equal, there would be no such thing as a masterpiece or quality at all. You could never talk about art because it would be so radically individualistic that you could never express why something is good or bad. You could never have awards, for example, because an award implies competition, and a competition implies standard rules and consistent methods of evaluation. But we can seem to express why certain films are good or bad, or why this piece of music is simple and repetitive and is no longer popular in 6 weeks. There is a reason that film studios pay John Williams and Hans Zimmer millions of dollars, while most composers have to have a day job. People have listened to Bach for 350 years and will probably continue to do so for as long as culture exists. Doesn't it seem like there are actually features of Bach and Williams and Zimmer which actually set their work apart from a dubstep remix made by a 10-year-old on YouTube? And don't think that this is a pointless philosophical conversation. This is directly relevant to your life and happiness. If Bach is so good that people are cherishing him 350 years later, there might be something to that which you're missing out on. If a Greek epic was so good that it is still in print today after 2,500 years, it may be worth a read, don't you think? The truth is that there are so many rich masterpieces out there, and most of us don't give it a second thought. And what I want to do, and what I hope you will join me in doing on this podcast, is to slowly explore those incredible works of art and understand and experience what it is about them that is so good. Because there are these barriers which keep us from enjoying these masterpieces. We don't understand the context, the language is antiquated, it's too subtle for us to pick up on, it's old, and so we just assume that we don't like it, and art is subjective. But if we have a guide who can shave off the rough edges and point out the subtleties, or else if we are willing to push ourselves, what I have found, at least, is that after pushing myself to explore over and over again, despite the fact that I'd rather be playing video games at the time, I have discovered some of the most profound and wonderful experiences that I've ever had. And the same goes for philosophy, or analyzing Christianity. If someone said something so profound that people are still thinking about it and talking about it thousands of years later, I want to be in on that conversation. You can keep your national politics and your local news. That's the conversation I want to have. So the question we're really asking has to do with the good life. How can I have a fulfilling life? What are the deepest experiences and the most profound thoughts and the most interesting conversations I can possibly have? And before we can even start that conversation, we have to establish that it is a conversation worth having. Because if you think it's all subjective and A Tale of Two Cities is just a different flavor of a novel than A Fault in Our Stars, then you see the world in a very different way than I do. If you think that the film Call Me By Your Name, about a homosexual romance between a 17-year-old and his friend's dad, is on the same playing field as Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a film about a white girl bringing a black man to meet her family in 1967, when interracial marriage was taboo and in some states illegal, then I don't know what to say to you. They are not the same caliber of film, despite the alleged parallels. We ought to be the kind of people with a keen sense for beauty and ugliness, as well as a refined sense of moral right and wrong, and an insightful ear for truth and falsity. And if you disagree with that, then there's not much else to talk about. So, we're going to talk about how art and beauty relates to the good life, and we're also going to try to unravel the paradox of whether art evaluation is a purely subjective matter, or whether there are objective standards for art evaluation. And lastly, we're going to talk about the philosophy of art and beauty as it relates to Christianity. Because if you're a Christian, or at least a theist, it makes sense that beauty, like truth and goodness, would find its grounding in the nature of God, in the very fabric of existence. At the end of the episode, I'm going to argue that in the same way we need God to ground in the nature of moral goodness, we also need God to ground the nature of beauty. Without such grounding, there really is no such thing as beauty, except as another word for pleasure. I'll argue that our experience of beauty as profound and sublime serves as a powerful argument for God, which bypasses reason and is truly undeniable. And then next time, we're going to actually ask the question of which standards we can use to evaluate art. Right now, we'll establish that you can use standards, and next week we'll actually talk about which standards are appropriate. How can we separate good taste from bad taste? How do we develop a good taste? What is good taste? And how can we derive joy and beauty out of art? I'm going to present my Christian philosophy of beauty and art with the help of three thinkers, C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer, and Aristotle. I would love for your analysis of my theory of aesthetics, as it's called, and I'm sure you'll find it interesting at least. Throughout our discussion, I trust there will be valuable insights and ideas along the way, and I hope that as I develop a Christian philosophy of aesthetics, you will be compelled to develop your own theory of art and beauty, and be inspired to pursue beauty in your own life, and become better at appreciating art more deeply, and thus live a fuller life. So the first thing I want to be sensitive about is how difficult it is to actually define art. I mean, think about it, just for a second. How can you define a category which encompasses ballet, smooth jazz, ice sculpting, watercolor, voice acting, novel writing, playwriting, acting, and much more? And does a failed piece of art still actually count as art? Is bad art still art? My cousin once gave me a two-dimensional wooden cat that he made in woodshop. They were told they had to make a piece of art out of wood for someone that they knew. And he went, well, my cousin likes cats. I'll make him a wooden cat. and I kept that ugly sucker for a long time after he gave it to me. Sorry, JJ, if you ever listen to this, I got rid of it. So a valid question is that art, even though it was terrible? And of course, saying that it is bad art implies that art is trying and failing to do something. Was JJ trying to create a picture-perfect two-dimensional wooden cat? And if he wasn't trying, was he really failing? After all, what's the point of art? Is it to deliver an experience? Convey some emotion? Communicate some idea? Pass a class? In the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras, art had a lot to do with beauty. Art was defined as a human agent harnessing his capacity for imagination and precision to capture beauty on canvas, or harness the imagined glory of God with an orchestra. The depth of both the sublime and the ordinary was harvested in order to test the limits of what we could do. Art was about progress as an extension of what it means to be human. To create and appreciate art was one of those things that set us apart from wooden cats. Today, art is usually defined merely as self-expression. Defecating in a box is called art, and if you question it, then you just don't get it. But despite this absurdity, inevitably self-expression does play some role in art. The reason a definition of art is important is because your very definition of art, your ideas about how to understand art, your ideas about the goal of art, are all going to be interconnected. That's why theories of art and beauty are somewhat circular theories, and they each have their own challenges. If the goal of art is pleasure, then good art is art which maximizes pleasure in its appreciators. But then what about art that makes us sad, like tragedies or depictions of war and violence? Does that then become bad art? It's also fascinating that in modern discussions of art, beauty has become completely foreign to the discussion, both within philosophical and creative communities. But obviously a theory of art is going to have to encompass a theory of beauty. Or maybe not so obviously. In a lot of postmodern views, beauty doesn't even really exist. Art consists of merely message and pleasure, with either being really optional. What is the artwork saying, and do you like it? That's the only questions you have to ask. Plenty of room for absurdity, shock pieces, and all sorts of repulsive things, which are called art. There is art without pleasure, so it's just a message, and there is pleasure without message, so it's just random colors. Perhaps a hole in a bucket spun around in a circle. Boom, $15 million. There's art. So let's just start with a basic definition of these terms, and then we can modify them as we look at various theories. Beauty is an ontological category akin to truth or goodness. It is, by definition, something pursued for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. This is called an intrinsic good. So, for example, you eat food because it's necessary for your health. Food is what we call an instrumental good, because you eat it to the end of being healthy. But beauty is the quality in our food which is pursued for something higher, something greater, and for its own sake. Beauty is like the dessert of life. It's not something you need to live, but it's something you need to live well. It isn't necessary for life, but it is necessary to have a fully flourishing life, to have a good life. One key distinction between beauty and art is that beauty is a feature of the universe, but art is a creation of man. Beauty is something we find in nature, perhaps, the mountains, or in our friendships, or in the ocean, or a combination of ingredients not added for their nutritional value. Art, though, is the intentional creation of something new which is trying to capture or harness that beauty. Now, you may immediately object that not all art is beautiful. Some works of art are actually ugly. But Kant observed that the opposite of beauty is not ugliness. The opposite of beauty is repulsion. So with that in mind, our definition of art is going to be the intentional creation of something essentially human with more intrinsic value than instrumental value. Art is something which reflects us, who we are as creatures, our desires, our fears, our emotions, our dreams, our nightmares, whatever it is, as envisioned by the artist. So some pieces of art are dreadful, terrifying, or disturbing, but they still count as art because they are the intentional product of the human mind, producing something of intrinsic value. Another component of art that should be in our definition is that Art is designed to impart a meaning or experience which may not be capable of translating into words. That meaning, that significance, that unspeakable thing which makes it so powerful that fellow men can see and grasp, but is not so easily put into words, that is art. You guys have seen me many times on this podcast try to explain a work of Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, and I often fail miserably. It's just boring to listen to. And the reason is because the artwork is something which is experienced. It's not explained. And sometimes I just can't catch the tip of the experience and convey it. Sometimes I do pull it off, and that's because storytelling is an art, and hopefully I have a tiny bit of talent in that art. And so I can convey this fragment of an experience that these artists are delivering. Anyway, let me read a quote from Francis Schaeffer, a Christian philosopher, on the definition of art. Quote, "When I was younger, I thought it was wrong to use the word create in reference to works of art. I thought it ought to be used solely in relation to what God can do. Later, I saw how desperately wrong I was. I am now convinced that it is important to understand that both God and man create. Both make something. The distinction is this. God, because he is infinite, can create out of nothing by his spoken word. We, because we are finite, must create from something else that has already been created. Yet the word create is appropriate, for it suggests that what man does with what is already there is to make something new, something that was not there before, something that began as an unmanaged part of reality, is transformed by the mannishness of man, and now reflects that mannishness. When I look at pre-Columbian silver, or African masks, or ancient Chinese bronzes, not only do I see them as works of art, but I see them as expressions of the nature and character of humanity. As a man, in a certain way, they are myself, and I see there the outworking of the creativity that is inherent in the nature of man." End quote. Do you see that piece in the end? I love that. Art is the human expression of the mannishness of man, an expression of his nature and character. And that's why art is important. That's why we love it. Because when we see art, we see different aspects of what it means to be human. We see more complexities, more capacities, more nuances, more experiences, more emotions that others have had and that we now get to share. Notice that on this definition, building doesn't necessarily count as art, because even though it is man-made, it isn't an expression of what makes us human. It merely serves a function. It is an instrumental good. But if you're an architect and you build a phenomenal house with incredible angles and skylights and pillars or whatever, now you're displaying the nature and character of man. You are harnessing our ability to use geometry and combine it with dirt and rock to create habitable and beautiful order. And you're not doing that to maximize square footage. You're doing it for its own sake, to impart a higher experience according to your vision. Now, when we ask the question of what makes good art as opposed to bad art, notice we are asking a question of value. And the more you talk about values, the more you're going to notice the challenges when different people value different things. Also, you're going to see the connection between beauty, truth, and ethical goodness, the three ultimate values, which are strangely connected. For an example of how ethics touches aesthetics, we could ask whether a propaganda film should be considered art. Can it be considered beautiful? With propaganda, you're trying to harness the beauty to be in the service of the good, as an ethical goal. And the reason propaganda fails as art is because art must be a pursuit of beauty, and beauty must be an end of itself. Propaganda makes beauty an instrumental good aimed at the higher goal of a moral good. Let me just lay this down as a rule. Whenever you make beauty an instrumental good rather than an intrinsic one, the quality of your art is destroyed. So if you're creating a film and the goal is to make money, then that's going to harm the artistic value of your film. Or if you're creating a film and your goal is to demonize the Jews, that's going to harm the artistic value of your film. Or if you're creating a film and the goal is to convert people to Christianity, that's going to harm the artistic value of your film. But I'm sure by now you're starting to see how difficult it is to honestly evaluate some of these aesthetic and ethical questions. For example, now that we know some of the horrible things Bill Cosby was doing in his private life, is it still okay to enjoy his comedy? People thought he was funny before he was convicted of his crimes. So what exactly changed? The tie between ethics and aesthetics is strange. This can be a really tough question. The reason I'm pointing out these things is to say that beauty, truth, and goodness are interdependent values. And if you believe that truth is an objective feature to the world, or morality is an objective feature in the world, you are being needlessly inconsistent to not admit that beauty is also an objective feature of the world. My point is also to say that questions of value will always spark disagreement, but just because there's disagreement does not mean there are no correct answers to questions of value. It also means that our perceptions of beauty, just like our perceptions of truth or morality, can be warped. We can be deluded, ignorant, skewed by bias, conflicts of interest, or whatever else. But we don't fall into the postmodernist trap of believing that just because we cannot agree on values, this implies that there are no proper or objective values. As applied to aesthetics, just because we do not agree on what constitutes good art, or good taste or bad taste, that doesn't mean that there are no right answers to these questions. So that's a good segue to then ask the question, which pieces of art are to be valued over others? How can you tell good art from bad art? And in order to even ask the question intelligibly, you have to create a value hierarchy, just like you have to have a value hierarchy when you ask ethical questions. But the mistake of the subjectivist is to just say that since we don't agree on values and there are an infinite number of possible values, there must be no true value hierarchy. Everything is subjective, and it's all just preference. They say this about beauty, they say this about morality, and they say this about truth, which is the most obviously absurd. Let me just point out first of all that the fundamental argument of the subjectivist is a non sequitur, meaning that the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises. It's a logical fallacy. The argument of the subjectivist regarding all values is that we don't know what to properly value, as evidenced by the fact that we all disagree. Therefore, there is no true value hierarchy. There is no truth except personal, subjective truth. There is no morality except personal, subjective morality. And there is no beauty except personal, subjective appreciation. And it's arrogant, elitist, and irresponsible to say otherwise. So if you think that some art is better than other art, you're just being an arrogant, elitist jerk, or you're irresponsible and ignorant. But wait a minute. It's important to remember that just because we disagree on value judgments does not mean that there is no truth to the matter. It just doesn't follow. The argument doesn't hold water. But despite this, there is a reason it's the most common view that I hear people espouse. It's very dominant in the culture. And it's understandable to be persuaded of subjectivism when you look at the broad variety of art and art appreciation. How can you possibly say that one piece of art is good or bad if there are so many opinions out there, and there seems to be no clear way to decipher why one person's opinion is more valid than another's? And if the point of art is merely to entertain the appreciator, then if they're entertained, the art did its job. On this view, the quality of art is measured by how amusing it is, whether it's music or painting or sculpture or film or whatever else. And if it's a really entertaining movie, then it's a good movie. And if it's a boring movie, it's a bad movie. And if different people have different things they find entertaining, then how could there possibly be an objective standard to it? On this subjectivist view, good art is simply art that you like. So a song is good if you like it. When you say, oh, this band is so good, you're not actually making a statement about the band. You're making a statement about your reaction to the band. But the subjectivists are only seeing one side of the coin. Yes, it is true that the enjoyment of any particular artwork varies from person to person. But if subjectivism is true and beauty really is just in the eye of the beholder, then what is talent? What is skill? Well, there is no such thing, because when you say this band is good, you aren't speaking of the band. You're speaking of your reaction to the band. And if that's just a biochemical reaction in the brain, then there are no standards or qualities at all to say that one artist is better than another, or one piece of art is better than another. There is no real way to understand why hundreds of thousands of people have liked Chopin, while 99% of all music ever created is never listened to at all. If I enjoy a play typed out by an artificial intelligence more than one by Victor Hugo, then for me, the AI is a better playwright. if teenage hormone poetry strikes my fancy more than John Frost, then John Frost is not that good of a poet for me. If subjectivism is true, there should be no Pulitzer Prizes for literature, no Grammys for actors, no Oscars for films, no awards for musicians, no film festivals for movies, no grades in art class, really no art classes at all. And how can you train to become better at making movies, for example, if there are no rules for what makes one film better than another? What are you training for? Because there's no objective world with which to measure good or bad. There is only like and dislike. Secondly, if art really is just personal taste, you shouldn't be able to talk about it. If I ask you why you don't like chocolate cake, there isn't much to say other than, I don't like it. But if you ask me why I don't like Batman versus Superman, there's a very long conversation that can be had. There are arguments that can be made for why you should like it or why you don't like it. That makes absolutely no sense on the subjectivist view. How is it possible to not be able to argue about chocolate cake, but you can argue about movies if they're essentially the same thing? So, if you're a subjectivist, you have to wrestle with the question of competency. Are some actors better than others? Yes? Okay, why? And if you give objective reasons, then you're admitting that there are standards by which we can judge some artists to be better than other artists, or some pieces of art to be better than other pieces of art, which undermines your claim that all art appreciation is equally arbitrary. You also have to wrestle with the problem of qualitative propositions. If you say that you like chocolate cake, you're actually making a statement about you. It has nothing to do with the cake at all. You're talking about your preference. But if you make a statement about Moby Dick, then you can make all kinds of qualitative propositions which can be true or false, and debated as such. There exists potential flaws, and the opposite of flaws, whatever that is, excellencies perhaps. That's a huge problem if all reading is just preference. Furthermore, what if the subjectivist definition of art is flawed? What if art is more than just mere entertainment? What if film is more than just passing the time for 2 hours? If there is any kind of higher aim to art, parallel as truth is the higher aim of an argument, then art is not just another form of passing the time or thumb twiddling. If art is more than just killing time, if it's about, say, imparting a human experience, then we can say that some artwork is better at imparting that experience, or some experiences are more profound and impactful than others. And if you can say any of that, then subjectivism is false. So, subjectivism moves the center of the conversation away from the art and onto the subject of the appreciator. Talent and skill become the ability to amuse, which cannot be uniformly measured, so all artists are equally arbitrary. Art is just subjective, competence is an illusion, discussion is pointless, and all expressions of art are just random psychological mishaps interpreted randomly by other psychological mishaps. I think subjectivism trades far too much in an exchange for an explanation of the diversity of honest opinion. So maybe it's not purely subjectivistic. Maybe it's culturally relative. When you say, this band is so good, maybe you're really saying, this band is good if you like rock. The theory of relativism already sounds more promising. On relativism, good art is defined essentially by a vote, within a genre or the context of a group of people. We can decide which arbitrary qualities constitute good or bad. So the artistic quality of a movie is defined as how many of us pay for a movie ticket, or the quality of a song is determined by how many downloads it has on Spotify. Now, obviously, if you don't have a taste for a specific type of art, you're not going to like it, but we'll talk about taste later. Taste is your assessment of what is good. We are asking whether there is such a thing as good, and the relativist says that good is defined by mutual agreement. It's decided by a culture, a group of people, a vote. But the problem with relativism is that now you're judging art based on arbitrary cultural standards. Isn't it obvious that just because a certain group of people like something, that doesn't mean it's good? And isn't it conversely obvious that just because nobody has heard of a certain band or nobody has seen a certain painting, that doesn't mean it's bad? Relativism is akin to the institutional theory of art, which says that art is defined by whatever the experts say that it is. That's a terrible theory. One of the ways you know it's a terrible theory is because public and expert opinion change all the time. It's completely arbitrary. It is incoherent to say that the quality of a piece of art changes based on cultural or personal whims. Good art should not be defined by vote, whether it's an expert vote or a vote of the masses. Now, I'm not saying that widespread opinion or expert opinion isn't a helpful indicator for whether or not a piece of art is good. But what I am saying is that just because everyone really likes the latest pop song right now doesn't mean it's quality art. And we know that because in 6 months everyone hates the song, and in a year nobody remembers it at all. So you can't ground the goodness of art based on popular opinion or expert opinion. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm going to heartily reject relativism because I don't care how many pop songs get awards and explode off the charts. Nobody likes them after some time passes, and they are proven to be fads. Remember when Call Me Maybe was a hit? That was years ago. Or Gangnam Style, or Kiki Do You Love Me, or whatever that song was called, or whatever the last Imagine Dragons song was, or whatever songs on the radio right now that that I don't even know about because I don't really listen to the radio. No, I'm not saying that you have bad taste if you listen to the radio. I'm just trying to give examples. On relativism, these songs were really good when they came out, but now they're not good anymore because they're out of fashion. But surely this is a really shallow view of art. That's why fashion isn't art, by the way. Surely clothing can be art, but fashion is defined by the latest trends. But a true artist is not chasing trends. They are chasing beauty. That's why pop music is so shallow. I don't mean the genre, I just mean mass-generated music that is just industrialized in order to try to be as popular as possible. Most pop music like that is chasing trends. They're creating music in order to be popular. It's the same beats, it's the same themes, it's the same stuff, just a different tune and a different performer. And then in 6 weeks, we'll be sick of it. Why? Because it wasn't good in the first place. It wasn't art. It was just fashionable tunes that would get stuck in your head. Now listen, I'm not trying to say that popular music doesn't have a place on your iPhone. I'm not even trying to say that if you like music on the radio, you have bad taste. All I'm saying right now is that art cannot be considered good merely based on the amount of people who enjoy it, because it's obvious that the most popular artwork is not necessarily the best, and unknown artwork isn't necessarily bad just because it's unknown. You can't ground the goodness of art in its popularity or the relative appreciation by the culture or an arbitrary group of people. So let's take stock on the difference between subjectivism and relativism. On subjectivism, everyone's view is equally wrong because quality art is defined as whatever you like. There is no voting, there is no good art or bad art, good music or bad music. There's just music that you like and music that you don't like, or film or paintings or whatever. On relativism, there are objective standards. This movie actually is better than that movie because the plot was engaging, the acting was believable, the characters were relatable, and the pacing was enjoyable. These categories of analysis are relevant, and how well they meet the criterion for success is more or less objective, albeit debatable. But at the end of the day, on relativism, our methods for evaluating art is arbitrary. The goodness or badness of art is determined by a vote and popular opinion. As time passes, films which won all kinds of awards pass into history and are forever forgotten. What was a smashing blockbuster hit in the summer of 2013 is barely worth becoming background noise on an airplane. The reason relativism fails is because there are good movies which bombed at the box office, did not win any awards, and which are not widely seen. Similarly, there are really bad movies that everybody saw and a lot of people paid to see and even a lot of people really like, but they're just not that good. You can't define good or bad art based on popular opinion. So relativism is bunk. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about objectivism, and this is the view that I defend. The idea is that art, like morality and truth, is objectively qualitative. there are standards which transcend personal preference or culture. John Milton is so good that you should learn to read English just to understand him. Or else, we should translate Paradise Lost into over 80 languages so that everyone can read it. John Milton isn't good for an English writer, or good for the 17th century. He's good for all time and in every culture. Man, I am so thankful that someone realized Tolstoy is a good writer, and not just that he's a good writer for that culture or for that era, but good art is not relegated to a time, era, or a culture. Good art is human art, and that's why it's not relative to a culture or its reception. That's why I think artistic appreciation and critique must also be transcendent. Art is not relative to the time and the culture in which it was produced. It isn't defined by how many people like it. Some music has been around for centuries. Some paintings are admired to this day. Some movies are recognized as being incredible cinema since the invention of film. Surely there are standards above our relative collective mood that can dictate whether art is actually good or not. Even if we don't know what the standards are, there has to be standards with which we judge whether a piece of art is good or not, which transcends how any individual feels about it, and transcends whether it is relevant in pop culture. Quality art is not defined as what you happen to like at the moment, or what the culture likes at the moment, but is somehow a feature of the objective real world. Good art is something which captures beauty, and true beauty transcends time, culture, and preference. And you know this, assuming you like music. When you say, this band is so good, you're trying to say an objective fact about the artwork itself. You are saying that their music touches something beyond yourself. And when you listen, you get to touch that beyond, and it is a meaningful experience. And this goes for whatever type of art you are experiencing. Literature, paintings, music, film, whatever. You're not just saying, this tickles my fancy, although perhaps it does, and there's nothing wrong with that. At least sometimes you're saying, this actually touches something deep within me, something human, something more than human. Good art speaks to the mannishness of man in a way that all men can see, which is why it doesn't matter whether you're an Asian making a mask in 2000 BC. It belongs in a museum, and when I see it, I should be able to see a piece of it that is myself. Because it's not about what I like. It's not about the culture or what's popular. It's about transcending all of that and touching something beyond. And that's why we like art in the first place. Beauty is an ontological reality, like truth or moral goodness. All art strives to touch beauty, just like all argument strives to touch truth. But, as I'll develop further next time, it's the wrong question to ask whether Van Gogh's Starry Night touches more beauty than Claude Monet's Water Lilies. The particularity of art is that it tries to reach beauty in the only way that it can, in its own completely unique particularity. The only variable is whether you see beauty easier in this instantiation of it or that instantiation of it. Having good taste can mean deeply enjoying the quality art that you are congruent with, or having enough aesthetic virtue to be able to genuinely enjoy a wide range of artistic expression without snobbery, which is liking something for the wrong reasons, or phoniness, which is pretending to like something when you actually don't. We're going to further develop my views next week, and I also introduce the views of art of C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer, and Aristotle, and then we'll end with my synthesis of their ideas to hopefully present a coherent and winsome Christian position that accounts for different honest opinions, as well as a hierarchy of value that can account for art and good taste, and a practical guide to finding beauty and expanding your appreciation of art. I would like to make 2 more points here, and then we'll be done. I had a debate with an atheist on November 19th of 2019, and among my presentation of 9 or so arguments for the existence of God, I told my opponent that, in my opinion, the best argument for God is the existence of beauty. While I was coming up with my arguments, I was listening to Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 9, I think, and I realized that this piece is so beautiful that I think it is the best argument for God because it bypasses your reason. You can't argue your way out of beauty. When you look deeply into the eyes of someone that you love, or you laugh way too hard with a bunch of friends, or you sink into a movie and forget entirely about your life, or you enjoy a really good meal after a long day, or listen to an incredible piece which brings your soul to life, there is no doubt in your being that there is more to this universe than matter and molecules. It doesn't matter what your logic tells you. There is something deep within you that knows better. Your reason has nothing to do with it. You are more than your reason, and your soul is happy. It's not a biological description, it's a spiritual one, if that term hasn't been destroyed for you by poor thinkers. There is no evolutionary reason for laughter, or joy, or art, or beauty, and yet it's there. And that's because the universe is more than survival. There's more to it. And I think that meaningful, sublime experiences teach us that if we're paying attention. The second thing is that I gave a talk in my first semester of college called The Objectivity of Beauty. And it was pretty terrible, but in it I had one really good point that I would like to repeat. One of the ideas that our culture is constantly trying to stress is the beauty of each individual, especially individual women. But beauty, according to the culture, is defined as external appearance, weight, hip-to-waist ratio, physical fitness, facial anatomy, sexualization, etc. But it's interesting to me that this is also held in parallel with the belief that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And what this means, besides the contradictory notion that it's an objective standard of idealized fantasy and also beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but what this means is that with each particular person, if no one actually finds you beautiful, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then by definition, when no one thinks you're beautiful, you're not. And I think this is something which is obviously absurd, but our subconscious doesn't always make that connection. And so women especially are told that if they are not catching people's eyes with their bodies, they are not beautiful. And on subjectivism, that's actually true. So either our assessment that everyone is beautiful and dignified is wrong, or our assumptions about beauty being subjective is wrong. And I went on to argue that it's the latter. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. It's in the actual things that we behold. And therefore beauty is there even if you are blind to it. And what this means is that there's beauty in the mountains, in the grass, beauty in nature, beauty in you, even if nobody sees it. And I closed by saying that if beauty is everywhere and in everyone, whether anyone sees it or not, then I invite you to forget the ego of what makes this or that appealing and instead try and find the beauty which is within every human soul, because there you'll find the image of God. In the Song of Solomon, which is a book of romantic and sexual poetry in the Bible, the poet describes his lover as a locked garden, a secret fountain of beauty. The image is of a precious and breathtaking area that no one else in the whole world gets to know about except for you. And I think that's what people are. People are these locked gardens. On the outside, people walk past it every day and think nothing of it, completely unaware of what's inside. They're just strangers. But for the one person who is given the key to the locked garden, there is so much beauty in their mannerisms, their individualness, which include passions, thoughts, memories, whatever. And it's theirs because God created them to be the person that they are. God created each of us as an individual masterpiece, but you can only appreciate them if you commit your life to doing it. And if you're too busy or not interested, then you'll miss the crown jewel of creation, which is people. Now, of course, people are also broken and sinful, so they have all kinds of evil desires and do repulsive things. But the mar of sin cannot ruin the image of God. And if that's not real, if that's not true, if all beauty is subjective and arbitrary and meaningless, then I can't see a reason why you would ever expect to find something worthwhile in each individual person. Instead, you should just float aimlessly and hope that you bump into people who you happen to get along with. And lastly, on that note, if we are the masterpieces of God, then we have a duty to partner with God in the development of our souls. in the tending of our inner gardens. We all have corrupted and repulsive things within us, but God wants to shape us into moral and aesthetic masterpieces. He wants to shape us into the kind of person who, when another person finally gets inside to see what we're like, they will weep because of our beauty. And that's who we will become if we have the humility and the courage to submit to Christ and the Holy Spirit and allow Him to transform our inner hearts. And love? Love is wanting to appreciate someone else's inner beauty, which is created by God. And that is worth appreciating. Thank you for listening to the Well-Read Christian Podcast.